Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing all the best eyeshadow palettes for fall. I picked out 16 palettes in total. I was going to try to keep it to 15, but I couldn't narrow it down, so I have 16 palettes that I think are perfect for the fall season. A lot of these are not super new. You may already have some of these in your collection, so hopefully this video inspires you to pull out some of these palettes during the fall season. But before I get into it, I would love it if you would subscribe to my channel and give this video a thumbs up if you do enjoy it, and let's get into it. So one of the first palettes that came to mind when I was planning for this video is the Huda Beauty Naughty Nude eyeshadow palette. Now, first of all, the packaging of this palette is very reminiscent of fall. Whenever I see this color, I think of the fall season, and the color story in here is pretty warm, but you do get a nice mix of some cooler toned purple and mauvey tones. I love that you also get some deeper matte burgundy shades. Where I think this palette really stands out is with some of the shimmers. Even though they can be a little bit on the flaky side, they're not difficult to work with. So I would recommend doing your eyeshadow first whenever you work with this palette, because some of the shimmers or metallics do have quite a bit of fallout, but the end result is super pretty on the lids. Now, the only downside to this palette, I would say, is the shade Slippery, which is not actually an eyeshadow. This is more of like a balmy texture. So this one I could honestly do without. I feel like something different would have been better for this palette. All of the other shadows in here do perform really nicely. This one is still available. I was hoping it wasn't limited edition, but it's not. I saw it on a few different websites. All of the palettes that I'm going to be mentioning are still available at the time that I'm filming this. Hopefully I didn't miss anything. Next up is the Natasha Denona Retro palette. This one leans more pinky and purple tone compared to the Naughty Nude palette. It's definitely not as warm toned, and I love Natasha Denona's formula. I feel like I've brought that up in quite a few videos at this point, but it's one of my favorite eyeshadow formulas. I do like that you get a couple of shimmers in here that lean more taupey, specifically this shade called Jude and Helio. So this one is Jude, and this one is definitely a taupey, almost silvery shade with like a hint of bronze. And then Helio, this one leans a little bit more rose gold, I would say, but these two are some of my favorite shimmers in the palette, and I just feel like there's a lot that you can do with it. So if you don't always want to do a berry or plummy leaning look, you do have a couple of like taupes in there. And then this one is also from Natasha Denona. This is the Yucca palette. Now this one I feel like is not quite as popular as some of her other palettes, but I love this one. I love that you get a really interesting mix of green shades, and you also get some mustardy greens. I don't know how to describe them, but this is a really fun color story. It's very different from anything in my collection. I used to not love green eyeshadow. I actually felt like it looked kind of weird against my skin tone, but over the years I've actually come to really enjoy green eyeshadow looks. I do find myself reaching for this not only during the fall season, but just year round. The one shadow that I feel like is a little bit out of place, but I have used it a couple of times, is this purpley silver one called Elysian. Now it's a really pretty shade, but it does kind of feel out of place amongst the mustardy tones in here and the greens. So whenever I have used this shadow, I do like to pair it with other matte shadows in my collection. And actually the color story in here and even the packaging reminds me of the show Breaking Bad, which is my all-time favorite show. Every time I look at this, I think of Breaking Bad. I think it just reminds me of a desert. Next up is the McGrath Mothership 5 Bronze Seduction palette. Now, this one I didn't actually pay for. This one was gifted to me by my sister-in-law, Flor. So thank you so much to her. I've really enjoyed this palette over the past few years. This formula is super, super pigmented. I actually have to be careful whenever I use this palette because I can be pretty heavy-handed. The mattes in here are extremely pigmented. I do have to go in a little bit lighter than I normally do, but the end result is really, really pretty. I would say my favorite shade is this one right here. I don't actually know the name of it, but it is a duochrome. It has such a beautiful shift to it. So I would say this is my most used shade in this palette. And then I also love this one. This one is straight up glitter and it's just super reflective. So I like to top the duochrome with this shade. And look at how intense that is. It's like a green leaning gold. This red over here, I don't think I have anything quite like this in my collection. I know it's a red, but there's just something really special about it. And then the one right above it is a beautiful rose gold shimmer. These I've actually used together. So yeah, this palette is absolutely beautiful. I don't think I'll ever get rid of it, even if I've had it for like over 10 years. I think this is always gonna stay in my collection. This one from Patrick Ta, this is the Major Dimension 2 palette. Now, I really like Major Dimension 1, but Major Dimension 2 is my absolute favorite. I find myself reaching for this one all year round. So this one is very rose gold, I would say. It does lean pretty warm as well, but what really stands out to me is the shimmers. Some of these have a really pretty flip to them. So these are all 5 shimmers in the palette. And look at how beautiful those are. Patrick Ta's formula feels very luxurious. And the mattes are super pigmented, but they blend like a dream. These are some of my favorite mattes in my collection. And you even get a couple of cream eyeshadows in here. I don't use these very often. I do find that they crease on my oily eyelids. So I like to use an actual eyeshadow primer when I'm using this palette. But they're super pigmented, very creamy, and easy to blend. But the palette as a whole, I think is beautiful. It's one of my all-time favorite palettes in my collection. The Anastasia Beverly Hills Rose Metals palette. Now this one is a very rich and intense color story. I feel like if you have a super fair skin tone, this one might pull a little bit too intense for you, but honestly I feel like any skin tone could use this. And I think especially on deeper skin tones, a lot of these eyeshadows are really going to show up on you. But this is another one of my favorite palettes in my entire collection. I know I've said that about a few of these already, but this one is really a favorite. I actually wore this the other day to a birthday party and I kept it really simple, but it was such a pretty eyeshadow look. I wish I would have taken pictures, but I was in a rush and I didn't. I ended up using this matte brown shade in the crease. This is a really warm matte shade, but I think this one pairs perfectly with a lot of the shimmers in here. And then I wore this one on the lids, and this is a shimmery green with a hint of gold. I do really like the old ABH eyeshadow formula, but I do really like this one as well. I actually find that this one is a little bit easier to work with, especially the mattes, I would say, don't have quite as much kick up. So again, if you like these richer eyeshadow tones, I think you're really going to enjoy this one. This one from Lorac, this is the Lorac Pro Palette Fairytale Forest. I feel like this one is very underrated. I don't hear many people talking about it, but I honestly feel like it deserves more attention because this is a great eyeshadow palette. Lorac has always made some really good eyeshadow palettes. I do remember one of my first high-end palettes was actually from Lorac. I think it was the original Pro palette, and I remember using that one a ton. It was one of my favorite palettes, but I don't have it anymore, unfortunately. I wish I would have kept it, but I think I just decluttered it along the way because it was a few years old. But this formula is very reminiscent of that, at least from what I can remember. The Fairytale Forest name of the palette I think is perfect for this color story because you do get some greens in here, you get some earth tones, and it's just a really well-rounded color story. It leans pretty neutral, I would say, and I just find myself reaching for this one over and over again. I do think it's underrated. I wish it had more attention because it is such a good palette. This next one is an oldie but a goodie. This is the Persona Identity palette, and this one I've traveled with quite a few times. I haven't traveled in a long time, but whenever I have, I've taken this palette with me because it's really easy to travel with. And this is just a really nice neutral palette. My go-to shade in this palette is this bronze one called Goddess. And I love this bronze because it is a neutral bronze. And I always like to apply that one all over the lids. And then I blend it out with Charming, which is this matte brown shade. It's just a really easy go-to look for me whenever I use this palette. So I highly recommend it after all of these years. They did update the packaging a few years ago, but honestly, this one works perfectly still, so I haven't repurchased it. Maybe if I hit pan on a couple of shades, I'll purchase the new one, but it's been working fine, so I haven't felt the need to replace it just yet. These next two palettes are both from Colourpop, and these are the only ones from Colourpop because some of the other ones that I really like for fall are not available anymore. Unfortunately, they are limited edition or they've been discontinued for whatever reason. These two, fortunately, are still available. These are both from the Star Wars collection, and I like to use these together because I feel like they complement each other super nicely. So this one is the Mandalorian The Child palette. I like that this one is a mostly green palette. You do get a few different green tones in here, but you also get a bronze shimmer, a lighter warm matte shade, and you get a deeper maroon as well. So it's a very well-rounded palette. And then the Mandalorian palette, which came out shortly after the Child palette. This one is a little bit more cool toned, I would say. You do get a few taupes and silvers in here, and this is actually a mostly matte palette. So actually, each of these palettes has 5 matte eyeshadows and 4 shimmers, which I actually think is a really nice balance since each of these palettes has 9 shades in total. But I'm going to be using these together. I have done quite a few looks with these, and I just love the end result. I love Colourpop's formula. The Huda Beauty Nude Medium Palette. This one, for some reason, I thought was being discontinued, but it's still available. This is one of her 9-pan palettes. I didn't see the lighter and the deeper one in stock, so hopefully this one isn't being discontinued because I do really enjoy this one. But this is a very pinky leaning palette, and I like this one for an everyday basis when I don't want to think too much about what shades I'm going to be putting together. You get a little bit of pink and mauve, and you also get some deeper shimmers in there. I would say the formula is a little bit different from her regular size palettes. This one isn't quite as blendable, I would say. You do have to build up some of the shades, and you just have to work with them a little bit more compared to her bigger palettes. So the formula is a little bit different. I do prefer the formula in the bigger ones, but it's still a good formula. And then this one from Essence, this is the Bronze to This Way eyeshadow palette. This one actually reminds me a little bit of the Nude Medium palette, but they're definitely not the same. You do get less shades in the Essence one, but just the overall tones in both of these palettes I think are pretty similar. I do have one more of these smaller Essence palettes, but this one is my favorite one. Of course, it's a bronzy palette. These are the kind of shades that I like to reach for in the fall, and the formula is really good. It's not going to be anything super impressive compared to some of the higher end palettes, but it's still a good one and it's very affordable. I think these retail for $3.99. I have 2 more drugstore eyeshadow palettes, and this one has been a long-time favorite. This one is from e.l.f. This is the e.l.f. bite-sized eyeshadow palette in Pumpkin Pie. I feel like I've talked about this one in a previous fall eyeshadow palette video, which I'm pretty sure I took down because I hated my makeup in that one, but I think I did talk about this one. So it's been a favorite for a long time, and this is only $3, which is kind of crazy. Of course, it's not going to be like a high-end eyeshadow formula, but it performs really nicely. Even after all these years, I haven't replaced it and it still works really well. I like that since this is a quad, you really don't have to think too much into putting an eyeshadow look together. It comes together really quickly, and I think the name is very fitting, Pumpkin Pie. So here are all 4 shades. As you can see, one of the shimmers leans more copper, and then the other one is more of a neutral bronze. You also get a medium matte brown shade and then a really deep cool toned brown. So this continues to be a favorite for me. Even though it is only $3, I feel like the quality is there. This next one is from Milani, and this is an all matte palette. I figured I would include this in here because some of you might not love shimmers. You might not wear it often. I wear shimmers all the time. It's really rare that I do an all matte look, but I like to reach for this whenever I do want an all matte look. I feel like Milani's eyeshadow formula can be very hit or miss. Some palettes are not as good as others, but this one I haven't had any issues with it. Today I actually used the lightest matte shade in the palette. I used it to kind of set my eyeshadow primer, so this palette has been really useful. I like that this palette is very neutral. If I want to use some sort of matte shade that another palette doesn't have, I do find myself reaching for this one. so I do recommend it. And then the palette that I'm wearing on my eyes today is the Natasha Denona Mini Nude palette. This palette is perfect to me. I honestly wouldn't change anything about it because all of the tones that I want are in here. I reach for every single shade, and because you only get 5 shadows, it's really easy to put a look together, especially when I'm in a rush. This to me is a perfect everyday fall palette. Like if I had to choose one palette to use every single day for the entire fall season, it would probably be this one. Even though I do have other favorites, but there's just something special about this one. And then finally, the last palette that I have is the McGrath Labs Venus and Fleurs Luxe Quad in Voyeuristic Vixen, which is a super long name, but this is a super beautiful quad. This duochrome in here is one of the prettiest in my collection. Look at how majestic that is. This one all over the lids looks insanely beautiful. And this other shimmer in here is also super pretty. This is like a taupey rose gold. That's like the best way that I can describe it. And then the lightest shimmer in the palette, this is like a champagne shimmer. And then I might as well swatch the deep matte shade in here. So here is the only matte in the palette. It's a really deep maroon shade, unless it's burgundy. I feel like I can't really tell what it is. But this quad is so pretty. It's super cohesive, and even though it doesn't have any lighter warm shades in here, anything that I could use in the crease, I honestly don't mind because these shadows are absolutely stunning. I usually take a lighter matte from a different palette, but those were all of my favorite eyeshadow palettes for fall. I really hope you guys found today's video helpful, and of course my cat really wants to be in this video as I'm filming the outro. Let me know in the comments down below what palettes you guys are reaching for during the fall season, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!